Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is resuming and restarting our discussions with a new book in 2022, the book that we are going to discuss. And I just want to begin by encouraging and recommending our viewers to get a copy, borrow from the library. You don't have to buy it, but I really like this. Is going to be one of my favorite reads of 2022, I think. Existential Monday, Philosophical Essays by Benjamin Fondane, edited and translated by Bruce Baugh. For this session, we agreed to read the introduction by Bruce Baugh and the first essay by Fondane, which is called Existential Monday and the Sunday of History. This essay was written by Fondane in the February of 1944. And a few months later, unfortunately, in October, Bruce Baugh says October 2nd or 3rd, he dies in Auschwitz with a poison gas. And so we are going to first, let's go around and talk about our first impressions of this essay and the introduction. Just our first initial thoughts. John, maybe?
I dare say that certainly more than me, maybe more than Davood, that Daniel probably has more immediate and sooner exposure to some of the primary sources that are talked about in both the first essay and the introduction, including Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Sartre and
Hegel.
A couple of others.
Hegel.
So the only one I even feel remotely comfortable talking about of those is Kierkegaard. And I think that Daniel might have read some of these people a little bit sooner. I'm kind of curious where he would start with this, if he's comfortable.
Please.
I think Daniel was reading Hegel in primary school.
No.
As one does.
No. Well, I agree with you, Davood. I think this book is marvelous. And it's just another example. I'm so grateful to you gentlemen for bringing up Hayden White to me, who I'd never heard of. And then you read and you're like, this is magnificent. My goodness. And here's just another example. I'd never heard of Benjamin Fondane. And then you start reading, you go, my goodness. It just always makes me think, it's nobody really knows anything compared to everything. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important to read on. You keep reading and you discover these new ideas. And, I love how he was referencing Berdyaev, right? I was like, oh, I remember him, the meaning of the creative act, or Montaigne, these different people. And there's all these just great thinkers there that kind of, it's important to keep reading. And it actually, I think also, where Fondane, something that's very impressive too, is that he is already aware of the dangers of putting too many eggs in the baskets of rationality. What I was really surprised by is to find that he was writing an essay about 5 years before Adorno and Horkheimer's the famous Dialectic of the Enlightenment, where they warned that the Enlightenment led to contributed to totalitarianism, Nazism of the 20th century. Well, here's Fondane already writing an essay. It had The Sound and the Fury, and I don't recall the correct where he is seeing that, and he is warning about the need to, very importantly, not to abandon rationality. That's one of those easy sort of lame critique. Oh, he's saying we need to be irrational. No, he wants to put rationality within its proper limits. And that's a similar thing as a Kierkegaard and some of these existential thinkers, Berdyaev that he mentioned, and so on and so forth. And I think that's very important. I think the other thing I'd say to start, and then I'll pass it to Davood, is it's important to think that what he said, a term I like, that my friend and I, Lorenzo, use is non-rationality. What Fondane is talking about is a kind of non-rationality. Now, from the vantage point of rationality, that's going to be irrational, but there are some things in life that are not fully captured by rationality that we have to think of, say, in terms of non-rationality. Let's just say art or beauty or these different things. But if you're in a world where you think everything needs to be rationally justified, then you're going to miss out on all that and potentially head in a very problematic direction. So to start, I'm a big fan of that train of thought. And it's just another example of another thinker who one can encounter that they don't even know that they haven't encountered, and that's why continuing to read and always looking for lifelong learning, I suppose is the phrase, is important, because you don't even know that you're missing out, right? So I'm grateful to you gentlemen to yet introduce me to another thinker I was unaware of.
Mm-hmm. I'm also grateful for this. John, would you like to share some initial impressions before I get into a discussion of the content?
Sure. I thought that I was pleased at how jargon-free the introduction was.
Right.
I think as you start to get into Fondane's writing itself, he is maybe a little too taken with some of the language that can be a little bit obscurantist that you see in Sartre or Heidegger. It's not quite nearly as bad as either one of those, but it sort of borders on the, purple prose-ish poetic, which by the way, we might want to talk about the idea of genre here and writing and how it affects or has any sort of how it compares with how other people do philosophy, because these are when the introduction was talking about his individual writing style, I was preparing myself for something much more fluffy. And when you get down to it, the text makes quite dense arguments in a relatively short. I mean, I think you could probably spend an entire lecture on 1 or 2 pages, maybe. But anyway, I think what he's trying to do is not only say that that rationality is maybe over-invested in, and I was also sort of interested in the introduction did mention Adorno and Horkheimer once or twice, right? And then the connections were just like dropped, and I thought there was so much more to talk about, especially considering when he was writing them, and he doesn't seem to have maybe met them but once, if that. No discussion of the of their school of thought, of the Frankfurt School at all. But in addition to, I guess, what he calls discursive reason, which is sort of the Cartesian idea of, strict logical inference and logical rules, that we also need a way of thinking that I guess we can accommodates the human experience. So it's kind of like it's sort of taking the ideas of passion, all of these sort of complex, hard to enunciate human emotions, and making space for them instead of having just all of philosophy answerable to one kind of like flattening discursive reason. It's opening up room for other kinds of logic and other kinds of feeling and thinking that are different and are especially built to accommodate human psychology, human feelings, human passions and desires. He opens up the first essay with whether or not the laws of the First Testament were made for humans, or whether humans were made for the laws. And I thought it was an interesting way to open up a series of questions about existence versus existence, that things that exist, Heidegger's old distinction between beings and capital being. But I don't know if those are takeaways or if that's sort of a rehashing, but that's what I got.
Okay, good. I wanted to note the continuity, the very accidental and happy fact that there's a lot of continuity from what we were reading and discussing before. Hayden White's concern with history, and White has a very existentialist approach to history and the unfinished, the looking at the past as an unfinished set of facts that we could revise, and driven by a principle that could be expressed like history is meant to serve humans, not the other way around. So Hayden White was really motivated by that kind of thinking. And the Sunday of history is not finished. It's still with us, and we can revise it, and we can dwell in it, think about it. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about was the reason why I really enjoy this writing. Now, in contrast to White, who was his style, who had a very academic style, and a lot of philosophy that we might read, especially contemporary philosophy, a lot of it is written by academics. And my own experience in academia is you talk in an academic setting with some people, you go to conferences, but once you get out of that, the philosophical talk usually stops. So it is a kind of reason and rationality that is within a bubble. It operates and serves, is pursued within a very strict academic professional setting. But Fondane, at the introduction, just a one-page introduction, Bruce Baugh writes that this essay was written in February 1944 during the occupation, at a time when he, Fondane, scarcely left his apartment, had no money, and barely had enough food to live on. And this essay reflects his situation. So rather than like imagine a philosophy conference, and the philosophy conference is interrupted by something like an earthquake, or the light goes off, and you just have an interruption. People stop talking about philosophy. They cannot continue moving. The thought stops moving into this situation of disruption, this situation that is unpleasant. But what makes Fondane lively and interesting, and the text just speaks to you, even if you are not an academic philosopher, not a professional philosopher, is because
he seeks out the unpleasantness.
Right, he's moving into it. He continues to move with his thought. He continues to think in those situations that are apparently, yeah, you might think of them as very non-philosophical, or there's a life issues, life interrupts your flow of work. So he is really alive. He does mention a lot of names and his contemporaries, Sartre, Camus, but if you're a little bit familiar with those works, the work is quite readable. The essay is very readable, I think. So just there's magnetism in his style of writing, and this passion, and the way he really cares. He really cares, and the way he talks. For example, he criticizes Sartre and Camus, but his criticism shows that he's not attacking them. He's really concerned with the subject matter. Unfortunately, it takes him 18 pages to say what he's doing. John, you pointed out how he starts the essay talking about the Old Testament, the dichotomy or the conflict between human concerns and the law, divine law. But on page 18, he says, I think that I'm not finding it now, but the task of this essay is to clarify what makes a philosophy, 28. The task I have set myself here is simply to distinguish between what is and what is not existential philosophy, which is on the surface a straightforward question, but he shows how many things that's related to and how many different forms that question takes, including the conflict between the divine law and the problems of the human being. Anyways, I'll pause there. Any responses to in general to the essay, or this existential philosophy, what it is not? Yeah, Daniel.
Well, yeah, excellent. I think it may have been in the transcript where the note from the translator said something like, there was this understanding that writing was thinking, that different writing led to different thinking. There was a tradition for a time, at least, of more literary philosophers. You mentioned Camus and Sartre, saw writers of the play, but you can go to Plato. If you include Dostoevsky, you had Kierkegaard, obviously, Nietzsche, they had a different style. And there does seem to be a different kind of philosophy that is produced in a different kind of style. I sometimes think that great novels actually are a kind of philosophical proof in the same way that sometimes mathematics can be a proof for scientific ideas, like a kind of structuring. If your philosophy cannot be put into a literary structure, or cannot be put in a literary structure, it may just be a pure abstraction. That there's some sort of interesting relationship between literature and philosophy, but that would be a different discussion. But there is something about writing style and way of thinking, and also the way that he writes is indeed suggesting that philosophy, our lives depend on philosophy, or getting this right, or figuring this question out, given his circumstance. This is not something where someone's sitting back and saying, oh, I'm going to have like a career and I'm going to progress. There's more of this sense of exactly what you described. He's starving in his apartment. The world is falling apart. And there's an idea that he believes that there's that if a society has the wrong ideas, that leads to very bad consequences, and that we need to figure out what real philosophy is, quote unquote, in order to fix that problem. And it reminds me of the part from the Turkov, forgive me, the novel where the doctor, he mentions it, where the country doctor is in and the girl falls to the ground and the doctor is horrified and he says, "Help, doctor, get a doctor." And there's this idea that Fontaine is saying that today it's like, help, a philosopher, get a real philosopher. There's this understanding where there's this posturing of what constitutes philosophy, which he puts together what I call, that I think someone like David Hume with the autonomous rationality, which is this notion of a rationality becoming the prime judge by which everything is understood. If it's real, if it is rational per se, if it can be put into rational terms, it is real. Of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then the only things you look for are the rational, which then confirms that, and it kind of feeds in on of itself. And there's this sense that he has that philosophers who are dealing with rationality as being primary versus, say, life or the non-rational, and I will say more about that, that's part of the problem. And he goes through talking about the Greek God is a God where he cannot, create, he can't change the past. He can't make 2 + 2 = 5. He can't make a rock he cannot lift. So this like a God that must do what's rational and logical. So logic, in a sense, is more powerful than God. But no, he wants to talk about a God that, yeah, he can change the past. Yeah, he can maybe make 2 + 2 = 5. He's not bound by logic. And that would be a God of the possible. And there's this idea that that's what we need, that we've done something similar by making reasoning primary. It goes back to that quote, and then I'll pass it on to John, which I really love. The connection where he says, the Sabbath, he talks about the law was made for man, not the man for law. Likewise, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, the Jesus line and Mark. So in a similar way, rationality was made for man, not man for rationality. And how, if we make that mistake, there's a kind of imprisonment that leads to, of which then directs us to very problematic ends. And so he's in his apartment desperately trying to articulate that, because he truly believes that it would seem he truly believes that if this mistake is not corrected, the consequences will only get more and more dire.
I thought for a few pages into the introduction that Bruce Baugh was setting Fondane up to be sort of maybe an absurdist, an irrationalist. Sure. But Daniel, you made the distinction between irrational and non-rational. Just like there's a difference between amoral and immoral.
Yes.
On page, this is 27 of the introduction. This is where what really caught my attention. He claims, even so, it's not a question of doing away with reason, but only of imposing limits on its excessive claims. Only on imposing limits. And then he quotes Fondane. When existential thought opposes rational thought, it is in no way attacking its essence or the results defined by the objectives that it pursues in its proper domain. All it's doing is attacking its inappropriate inference in a domain of concrete existence, which is beyond its means of investigation. That's all it's doing.
Yes.
So instead of saying that this sort of Cartesian discursive rationality can deal with everything, maybe it can only deal with certain kinds of problems. And not everything. I guess Kierkegaard. He's really interested in Kierkegaard because, I mean, call me out on this if I'm wrong, but I think he's probably one of the first people who, and this is probably why a lot of people identify him as the beginning of existentialism. He is more concerned about what's going on inside the human mind than he is about metaphysics.
Sure.
He's much more interested in how the human mind operates and the negotiations and the everyday sort of paths that we take, like, whether we take that path between the moral life or the life of the hedonist, or the what does he call it? It's either or. It's the life of the religious person or the what? I'm forgetting it.
The aesthetic,
resignation.
The hedon. I mean, it's basically the pleasure seeker. Yes.
Yeah, the artist or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is not kind of language that Hegel certainly not Hegel couched his philosophy in, or Kant, or they're talking about universal concepts. And here, Kierkegaard is trying to talk about, how we make decisions in our life and how we're going to devote what we devote our lives to, and priorities that we have to radically choose between. And it's not this sort of abstract metaphysical thing. It's this very real, concrete thing that everyone can relate to, because we have to make those choices too.
Mm-hmm.
And he, of course, I think to some degree, Heidegger picks up on that too. At least the concern with the sort of being in the worldness, and then I think that's what makes what makes Fondane really compelling too, is the fact that he's not just talking about abstractions. He's talking about, how we use reason, and the limitations and delimitations of reason might sound abstract, but they're surprisingly applicable.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this opposition between rationality and irrationality should be really handled with care, as you both emphasized. So it is not about wanting to be, like, choosing to be irrational and just completely abandoning reason and rationality. It is about recognizing that within the space of rationality, certain things are not represented. Certain things don't have the space for representation. So a good analogy is, like, imagine a society where there's an opposition between two classes of people in a society, and one class of people are treated unfavorably and maybe unfairly. But there's a third group in that society that are not even represented in the way that people are commonly thinking, in the common sense of that society. So it is about that so what Daniel refers to as non-rational is a wider space of representation, that more things than other than rationality could also fit into our description, so we can pay attention to them. The Turgenev connection was, I also really enjoyed that. So it's a philosopher who calls, oh, please, is there a philosopher? Similar to how a doctor is, in that story, is calling for a doctor. And what that shows is a faith in reason. So a relationship with reason that is based on faith. So a philosopher has faith that somebody, there is a philosopher somewhere that is able to solve this problem, who will be able to satisfactorily, in a satisfactory way, get over this obstacle, even though I cannot do it, even though I am also a philosopher, but because I have faith in principle, in reason, in the power of reason, and in the sufficiency of reason, that no matter how exceptional a situation is, the situation that is at hand, how exceptional, how eccentric, how extraordinary it is, that in principle, reason would be sufficient in dealing with it. And by reason, we mean abstract thinking based on general categories, universal categories. So that it brings us to the distinction between existentialist philosophy and non-existentialist philosophy. So a non-existentialist philosophy, in the duality between knowledge and existence, so things that we know and things that exist, all philosophy acknowledges both of those things, both facts and our knowledge of the facts. But primarily, non-existential philosophy is primarily looking at the world through the lens of knowledge, and that is the key shortcoming, according to Fondane. That even when somebody calls themselves an existentialist philosopher like Sartre, they might call the human person a useless passion. And by that, they reveal something. They betray that they are still looking at the human being through the gaze of reason. Because they are looking at the human being through the gaze of reason, through the gaze of knowledge, they are saying, oh, this is useless. And of course, they're celebrating that uselessness. But the fact that they are calling it useless as opposed to, apathetic or indifferent to usefulness or some other category, they're regarding the human being as a useless passion. And then Camus also similarly talks about existence as a useless passion, similar to Schopenhauer, just the wild force of will that is creative but doesn't have a purpose. The other thing maybe we can touch on is the concern of existentialist philosophy with exceptional cases. So cases that are not that are not quote unquote normal. They are not typical. They are not a type. And he says, of course, this is usually imposed or forced upon the life of a philosopher like Kierkegaard. Maybe deep down he wanted to get married to Regina Olsen, but just he couldn't do it. He had to become an exception and live an exceptional life. And Fondane himself, sorry if I'm taking too long, but what made him exceptional at the end of his life was he refused to leave his sister, who was going to go to the concentration camps. He was, his friends arranged his escape, and he just said no.
He could have walked.
He could have walked. Yeah, he could have been free, but he just emphasized that the existence of one contingent relationship, that for him that was the thing that stood out. The thing that of course he was supposed to do something else. A rational response was to escape and save his life, but he was faithful to the existence that was right in front of him. Anyways, that's it for me for now.
No, that was outstanding. And there's something about faithfulness. I mean, if he stays, he and his sister will die. Why not he go? She's going to die regardless. So it would be rational to go. And yet there is something precise. That's kind of a calculus. But there is something about following that calculus that actually would rob the nobility and honor of it. Maybe if he left, we would go, well, I mean, of course, right? That makes sense because there's no need for both of them to die. But the fact that he didn't, there's something about that you can't even put into words. It's like the act itself kind of shines forth with a sort of honor and meaning that is non-rational because it shines through and has a power to it. And I think that does get to Kierkegaard. When we're talking about the book Either Or, he has that part somewhere where he says, if you get married, you'll be unhappy. If you're single, you'll be unhappy. If you get a good job, you'll be unhappy. He goes to this long list where he's basically saying either or. There's good reasons to do it. There's bad reasons to do it. Everything is like that. Every single choice has this kind of either or-ness to it. At the end of the day, you have to choose that. And since precisely you can basically find good reasons not to get married or to do a job or to write, whatever, you just list it. Ultimately, the choice, you may think it just comes down to rationality, but there's the raw, what he calls leap of faith. Now, often the leap of faith gets just associated with a theological decision, but it actually can help if we think about it as a non-rational commitment or a non-rational choice, where you say, yes, there's good reasons. I'll just use the marriage example because of his situation. There's good reasons to get married and there's good reasons not to get married. So ultimately, the choice has to be non-rational, very similar to that old story of the donkey, stuck between two evenly sized piles of grain, right? So you got two evenly sized piles of grain and the donkey starves to death because it can't make a rational choice. So ultimately, the donkey, in a sense, has to do something irrational precisely to eat, because otherwise rationality would paralyze it. So in that sense, there has to be a non-rational act. And Kierkegaard basically wants to show that our life is full of situations just like that donkey. We just don't realize it because we convince ourselves that we can put it into rational terms, and we kind of jump ship a little bit early and ignore the fact that we do something non-rational, which of course is very consequential, because then you continue to give eminence to autonomous rationality, as David Hume talks about, and that leads to totalitarianism, or nobody staying there for their sister because they're just doing what falls into a rational calculus. Another way, so you can almost say that rationality without non-rationality becomes autonomous rationality, that worldview that the Scottish Enlightenment is so concerned, which tries to understand all of life in rational terms, which necessarily has to be reductionist. It has to take a lot away. And also, every single time you end up in that donkey situation or an either or situation, you just die. You never commit to anything, and you just stay in the middle and nothing comes of it. But that's where autonomous rationality, almost by definition, has to lead you. And, another one, it would seem also where Mr. Fondane emphasizes the possible. It does make me think of the work of After Finitude, Quentin M., whose last name I can never say, which basically wants to say there's no natural laws, it's all just natural habits, that there's a radical contingency, that there's a part in the book that basically says, at any given moment, anything could collapse in on itself, trees could cease to be, natural laws could break, everything at any moment could change, that there's this really radical contingency to all of the world. And it's almost like, it's always dangerous to bring up a thinker like that because you don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I associate Fondane with that line of thought of radical contingency and how that's actually liberating in the same way that Quentin seems to suggest. Also, it may help viewers, again, it's another subject, but a lot of what Fondane is saying actually is justified kind of by Nash equilibrium and game theory. And a Nash equilibrium is a situation where if all actors are rational, you get a suboptimal result. all the rationality cancels itself out. In order to get a rational result in a Nash equilibrium, someone has to do something non-rational, say a traffic jam. If everyone races out to get first, you get a traffic, they leave work. Marcuse talked about this in the one-dimensional man. You get a irrational outcome. You get a suboptimal outcome. So again, another thing, it's just amazing to me, a lot of what Fondane is saying, when you hear, oh, he's saying be an absurdist irrationality, that's no, there's actually a lot of like academic work that kind of justifies what he's saying. Now we could go into detail on that, but a point to close that I would make, is to really kind of ask the question, would the world really be a better place if there was only rationality? And Fondane kind of says no. And an example of this, a movie I really like that I saw recently is a movie called Looper. But there's a giant plot hole. It doesn't make any sense how the time travel works in that movie. Or take Terminator, right? You can't really justify the time travel. Would the world really be a better place if there was no Looper or Terminator because you're only allowed to have stories that are fully rational? Or what about like the paintings of Dali, right? I think a lot of his paintings are just raw images. There's not necessarily a meaning or an explanation for why he made the image the way he did. I think there's some meaning, but you can't just understand, say, the paintings of Dali or some of the absurdists or whatever in purely rational terms. All right, well, in a world of autonomous rationality, you got to get rid of those paintings. You got to get rid of all the movies with loopholes. You got to get rid of all those things. Would the world really be a better place? Would we really be a better place if you could never have any of those images or art? I think not. And it's not hard to imagine that there are many examples of choices we make in our lives that likewise cannot be, that almost in a sense are like plot holes. They're rational holes. We just kind of make a leap of faith. Our lives actually would not be better without those things. And in a closing way to think about it is, Leibniz has that part where he asks the best of all possible worlds. God had to make the best of all possible worlds, right? If God made a creation that has, say, non-rationality part of it, there would be reason to think that non-rationality is in heaven, right? Whereas the philosopher, or part of, the entire creation, whereas the philosopher that Fondane is concerned about would suggest that in the best of all possible worlds, there would only be rationality. There would only be rationality, that would be the perfect state. But in fact, there would be reason to think that you might be missing out on a lot. But then to close, I do think he wants us to all realize that at any moment, we could become the exception, right? And that's what you were closing on, Davood. Like we have our life and it's all organized and so on and so forth. Well, and then the Nazis are invading France, or you have a situation where you have to choose what you're going to do with your sister. So rationality can make things feel comfortable, make it feel like you have a plan that's going to go along and it's all going to be good. But awareness of that radical contingency and that radical possibility that could break through, that could make you the exception at any point, I do think is fundamental to his thinking, and will change how you think about life in general, I think.
Does he ever have a name for this sort of complementary thing that is supposed to accompany instrumental rationality? Does he ever give it a name, or is it just sort of another way of thinking and reasoning, or does he call it anything? I don't remember him calling it anything.
I think that is for him existential philosophy.
Existential philosophy. Okay. Well, I guess when I was reading the essay, I thought back about what happened with him and his sister, and I might be getting some of the details wrong here, but does Life is Beautiful? Remember that movie from about 25 years ago with Roberto Benigni, and one of the last scenes is Roberto Benigni's character is being walked from his cell by a Nazi officer off to his death. He knows that that's where he's going. And he's been separated from his child, but his child has drilled a hole in the wall, or there's a niche in the wall where they can see where he is. And as he's being carried off, or walked, I should say, reason tells us this sort of lame reason tells us we should hang our heads, or we should run, fight or flight, maybe. Instead, what he does, he knows his child is in love with clowns. So I thought about that scene, and what he does is he walks, and as he walks past that niche where his child can see him, he walks like a clown. Mm-hmm. And that sort of, I guess, the admiration that we have when we see that, the deep love and compassion that embodies has something to do with that existential philosophy. Oh, but it doesn't. It's not obvious. It's not a choice that comes out of that act of walking like a clown to please your child, to give them one last smile before you will be killed, is not an act of like self-interest or anything like that. It's made completely out of interest it's the choice of someone who recognizes other beings in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe what existential philosophy, what it's trying to get at, what it's largely concerned with. It's human-centered.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of place for humanism and the sort of intersection between humanism and existentialism. I think Kierkegaard's a good place for that. But that really stuck out. I mean, that image, it kept playing through my head, because obviously there's one set of expectations when you're told you're going to be carried off to your death, and he chooses the one that reason doesn't choose. I don't know if anyone thinks that's interesting, but
yeah, and that it takes to see that act as a possibility, and to choose it, to just to basically go for that creation of that moment. It is an act of creativity, and it is an act of you announce your belonging to not maybe this situation, but in a different world that is equally powerful, even though it is not explicitly at play right now. Maybe it is not the most powerful world in that conflict, but it is powerful, and it can be in a very small, with a small gesture, it can be shared, it can be communicated.
Because I mean, imagine how different of a scene that would have been if what he did was hung his head and looked straight forward,
mm-hmm.
and just that's what his child saw when,
mm-hmm.
That would be weeping, and that would create a weeping audience, but weeping for a very, very different reason.
It's a difference between being completely oppressed by the situation and having no, like, almost invisible as an agent, mm-hmm. and still finding a way to demonstrate agency and exercise agency. Mm-hmm. It connects with the passage here that I really like from page 25. He says that this is an idea that philosophers don't, in that the way you describe that moment from the movie, philosophers don't allow themselves to be like that. So here he writes at the top of the page, the second line, an idea that has weighed too long on our tradition wanted the philosopher to be recognizable solely by the fact that he is constrained. Constrained is italicized, by something. So a philosopher should be constrained by, the limits of the logic, the law of non-contradiction, being responsive to the empirical world and the rational principles. So it is something that has weighed too long on our tradition. Wanted the philosophers, this idea, wanted the philosophers to be recognized in terms of their constraint and maybe their loyalty to those constraints, maybe including facts, the phenomenal reality. But says Nietzsche, the true philosopher's mission is to command and to impose the law. And that was a beautiful example you said. That was an imposition of a law of that family. The expression of the consistency with what the little son liked, the clown. That's
and maybe being an Übermensch for Nietzsche means what is said at least once in the introduction, and maybe he says it in the first essay, that to a man who refuses to die, reason is nothing. He says it in there. It might be. It's paraphrased, needless to say, because I can't remember the exact quote. But in the face of death, you can defy reason, and of course he's not saying that in the sort of contradict logic. He's saying it in the more profound sense.
Mm-hmm. And that's very. I find it very important regarding understanding Nietzsche, which is like being in the Übermensch is not powerful and like dominating other people physically. It is about a different kind of power and creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, John, that was excellent. And, one of the things that seems quite critical is, the dad, when he does this act with the child, it's a beautiful movie. he has to have faith that the child, the enemy also of doing those sort of things could be cynicism, where you sort of say, oh, well, look stupid, oh, the kid won't get it, or it's not appropriate or whatever. Well, that could be one of the problems today. Like reasoning has, perhaps the idols of reasoning have been hurt by the world wars, and it led us to these things, but it led to cynicism and a bad kind of irony. And David Foster Wallace talks about that in different things. It would seem to be there. It also, the other story made me think of, if we have Thomas More, man of all seasons, and he refuses to give the king the divorce or all these things, and it's kind of like, come on, man, just give the king the divorce. And he's like, he's not going to do it. So he ends up getting executed. There's something very noble about that. But what's also linked up, I think, for Kierkegaard is a very big risk. What if Thomas More's interpretation of the Bible is wrong, right? What if the Bible really does make divorce okay? And so he's ultimately stupid in a way, right? You're kind of doing something dumb and absurd, right? So there's this really, and yet a lot of people today agree that divorce, as Christians, they'll say that divorce is okay, and yet there's still a sense of a nobility for Thomas More, even though you think you must, by that your logic, think what he did was kind of dumb, because there's something about taking a risk when you could be wrong, and you ultimately, like rationality is not there to support you in a sense, right? So you're saying, I believe this is what the Bible says. I can't have certainty, but I'm going to stand for it to the point of death, that there's something there, quote unquote, non-rational, that also seems to be the solution to the meaning crisis that Viveki and everyone's talking about. That also seems to be what people want in their life. You just to sort of infuse it with something meaningful. People want to be able to be the dad who walks by like a clown for their son in their final moment. That's what people want, in a sense, to go on a limb. I think there's a sense that people want to be able to do that. And what Fondane is telling us is, well, if you put all your eggs in the basket of rationality, you're not going to get to the place where you can do that. So let us look outside of it. And I think that for him,
people would just like to think that action is a possibility.
Yes.
That's even a possible choice. Many people would just, they concede, they hang their head, or they break out in tears or whatever, that those are the only those finite options are the only options. It doesn't even enter our minds to think that maybe we can do something else with our final act, our final public act.
Oh, and to me, the extraordinary idea, Plato has this whole day where he talks about like the whole point of it all is the good death, right? The good death is the good life, and these things are linked together. What's so funny is the good death philosophy is always talking about, for me, is precisely that kind of moment of which transcends rationality, that therefore philosophy becomes purely about rationality. It loses the ability to incubate in people the ability to have that kind of good death. And so philosophy becomes its own worst enemy, per se. It becomes its own force of losing its power, and Fondane has a sense of that. The other thing I was going to say, you mentioned Nietzsche, and he mentioned a thinker named Berdyaev, who wrote a wonderful book called The Meaning of the Creative Act. And in that book, Berdyaev says something along the lines of, the only act of creation is ex nihilo. Otherwise, you're just causing. Therefore, he says only God can truly create, but human beings can participate. And the more ex nihilo we create from nothing, the more we're creating as opposed to causing. And what Berdyaev warns is, if you only use reasoning, you're just causing, because there's a something out of which you are operating as opposed to a nothing. To actually create, it must be in a sense ex nihilo, and therefore must be an act of faith, or where you're going out into life and you can't fully capture it. I think actually that is what Nietzsche is trying to get at with the Übermensch, because he's just said God is dead, so all the givens of the social order are gone. So it's a kind of ex nihilo. And so for Nietzsche, he's like, all right, we don't have anything. So now is the first time we as a humanity can create. This is actually the first time we can create, following kind of the Berdyaev idea right there. So how do we do it? What will the meaning of this creative act be? Well, unfortunately, Nietzsche left us early. I think we've all been sort of trying to answer that question ever since. I think our ability to answer it will get better if we own the role of non-rationality. If we understand that we need a kind of, dare I say, dialectic between rationality and non-rationality. I do think this dialectic of thought, if I use that Hegelian term, dare I say, which he may not like, he may like, it depends, he does refer to that as existentialism. I do think sometimes the word existentialism is used to do too much, because it's such a diverse category. I almost want to talk about an aesthetic epistemology between the lived experience, the aesthetic, the beautiful, with the rational, going back and forth, trying to inform one another so that you avoid quote unquote Nash equilibriums or instrumental rationality in these different problematic ways. But to bring it back to what I said, I absolutely think that the name of the game is to be someone of whom can, in those key moments, like the Thomas More, the risk of the absurdity, take that leap of faith, or the dad walking by acting like the clown, to live in such a way that you realize that you even imagine that is possible, and then you do it when the time comes. And I think Fondane is correct that philosophy as it traditionally stands may not be best at incubating that in people, and thus he is calling for a sublimation, I suppose, a change.
Mm-hmm. Let me add one note related to that, which might connect a couple of dots. If you remember in this essay, I think he's quoting Karl Jaspers when he says, existentialist philosophy, what it does is that he doesn't give us things at the end. Once we read and understand these works, we are left empty-handed. And that is a beautiful image. And I think it really rings true to with the things, with the cases we listed here, including the Thomas More, his own decision to not leave his sister at in the prison. So once we know these decisions, existentialist philosophy, or we can extend that to life, existentialist living, once we know the decisions made and explanations, descriptions, we are left empty-handed with regards to our own choices, our own decisions. So that also fits with what you said regarding the creative act being ex nihilo, from nothing, because we are empty-handed. And maybe the task of existentialist philosophy is precisely to make our hands empty, to make us realize that we are empty-handed already, and we should be, in order to create in a way that is faithful to the exceptional nature of our lives, exceptional character, what is special, what is unique about our lives, not what is in conformity to the universal categories and how things should be according to generalities and so forth.
No, absolutely. An empty hand is also an open hand. It's the same act, that either or Kierkegaardian potential. And so the question simply becomes what we do with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I think it's already 10 p.m. I think we can devote a whole session to his critique of Hegel, which I will be really interested in. I think there are some valid points in that discussion, but I think there are shortcomings to his treatment of Hegel, because my impression is that he has an individualistic bias, that for Hegel, the same things, the same properties of exceptionality and existentialism applies to the community of people, the history of people, as a whole, not to individuals. But I think he insists that Hegelian stance of looking at the community and the history of a community is necessarily a generalist emphasis on knowledge and not on facticity, or not on things that exist. But anyways,
from the little that I could piece together in the first essay, I thought that Fondane's critique of Hegel was largely along the same lines as Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel. Of course, Kierkegaard hates Hegel with a passion, because he tries to offer a totalizing system. And Kierkegaard says, well, philosophy is all about what an individual, what a single existence is experiencing, their urges, desires, commitments, etc. It's not about history or the incantatory power of the state or something like that. It's about a single person. Whereas Hegel is trying to create some sort of huge architectural superstructure of philosophy. He's more concerned about individual human experience. But I think that also sort of goes back to the idea of a logic, loosely used, that is applicable to maybe built for human psychology or psychology of communities, versus a logic that is built to describe physical systems, mathematics. If A equals A cannot be not A, that sort of thing.
Right.
But I would be curious to know what you have to hear to to say about his critique of Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
You do mean in the first essay, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, it's always interesting. You know, we've got Hegel, who gives us when he's very young. He writes a story, you know, on the life of Jesus, and which is quite different than the phenomenology of spirit, which some people are like, it shouldn't be called spirit, it could be called mind. And then people are like, no, he's talking about consciousness, you know, and it's like, what are we talking about? And then you have the philosophy of right and the philosophy of history. And, you know, there's a lot of revivals of Hegel that are going to de-emphasize the philosophy of the right. It's going to de-emphasize the philosophy of history in favor of the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic, which are going to be, you know, arguably, arguably in the phenomenology of spirit, if we just focus on that, there's a movement of reasoning actually in realizing its fullness precisely in a state of non-rationality, in a negation that is a sublimation. It becomes a non-rationality with the with the N-O-N in parentheses. That rationality becomes more rational in a sense by realizing its limits, so then it transcends rationality. Well, you know, we then have to, you know, if you want to emphasize that more psychoanalytical take of Hegel, you're going to de-emphasize the philosophy of the right, which is what Marx, and you know how you had the split between the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians and different things. You know, a lot of what Fondane is going to be living through is a world that is emphasizing the later Hegel. Arguably, the phenomenology of the spirit, the early Hegel, is I don't want to say ignored, but it is not the main thing that people are focused on. In the later works, you know, Zizek comes along and basically kind of disregards the philosophy of the right and the philosophy of history and says, well, he just wrote that at universities to make the to make the administrations happy. That's not really what he thought, and so on and so forth. Well, arguably, that is primarily what inspired a lot of Marxist thought. And that's where you get the idea of the systems building and different things and so on and so forth. I always, when I encounter, like, you know, so I would disagree, you know, with some of the interpretations of Fondane. Funny enough, I actually think Kierkegaard hated Hegel, but there's a lot of thinking in Hegel that is like Kierkegaard, which is pretty comical. That's almost the anxiety of influence sort of thing. You know, I think when you encounter a thinker, like, for example, does one, when they read Fondane, decide that they're going to spend a lot of time arguing why he's wrong about Hegel? Well, then you end up making your thinking about Hegel, you know, Fondane's take on Hegel, improving the right reading of Hegel, as opposed to focusing on Fondane. So, you know, when I read Fondane in the same way when I read Kierkegaard going after Hegel and different things, look, Hegel's not easy to read. And, you know, some people are arguing that Zizek is a very bad interpreter of Hegel, and that a lot of the psychoanalytical takes on Hegel are not exactly good. But that's the great game. And I just think that instead of kind of going, like, understanding what Fondane is living in, you know, what is the most popular reading of Hegel? What is Hegel mostly taught at the time? And that's what he's responding to. He's responding to the Hegel that is in the air at the time. And if we're talking about that Hegel, which is very Marxist, well, he's right in his critiques of that Hegel. I don't think that's the true Hegel, but that's just the game. And does one want to spend all their, you know, get rid of Fondane because you think he's incorrect in that way? In the same way, you know, a lot of people who follow an emphasis on the phenomenology of spirit are also going to say that Marx misread Hegel, because that is a move you will need to make in order to really emphasize the early Hegel. But of course, some people would disagree with that. So, you know, those would be my take. I think that Fondane, to summarize everything I just said, I would say Fondane is critiquing the later Hegel. And one could argue the later thinker is the more real thinker, because isn't that where they refine their thinking in that direction, right? You know, is the early thinker Hegel? Those are all debates we have to decide for ourselves. I have been tempted to write an extensive page, you know, if there's enough time in the day, on Hegel, you know, the early, later, and what do we mean when we talk about what Hegel said, and so on and so forth. I have a similar, you know, when it comes to David Hume, I see it. There's a similar sort of dilemma at play.
Yeah, I was interested. I'm always interested in how a thinker critiques others, even if that critique is unfair, because it just helps us understand the thinker a little bit better. But yeah, we might encounter that in future essays. We might encounter Fondane's Hegel in one of the three remainder essays. But I think for now, I'm happy with this discussion. Shall we call it today?
Sure.
All right.
You know,
Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.